We're firing him next week. My name is Kevin Matthews. I'm 34 years old and I'd been working quality control at North Peak Engineering for 3 years. The words hit me like cold water spoken in Mandarin by my manager, Greg Lin, to our visiting CEO, Hengi, during what they thought was a private moment in the break room. They didn't know I was standing just outside the door. They certainly didn't know I understood every syllable. I'd spent 5 years in Shanghai as a teenager when my dad worked for an automotive supplier. Those years taught me more than just the language. They taught me patience, how to watch, how to listen, how to wait for the right moment. Greg had asked me that morning to train the new hire Jacob Torres, who was starting Monday. Fresh engineering graduate, eager, willing to work for less than I made. I should have seen it coming. The signs had been there for months. Greg's subtle dismissals during team meetings, the way he'd started excluding me from client calls, how he'd begun speaking more Mandarin around the office, thinking it gave him some kind of shield. I walked back to my desk and sat down. The manufacturing floor hummed below us through the glass partition. Machines cutting precision parts for Detroit's automotive industry helped streamline half those processes, saved the company close to $200,000 last year alone with efficiency improvements. But Greg wanted me gone. I pulled up the training schedule he'd sent me for Jacob. Comprehensive. 3 weeks of deep system access, payroll, procedures, quality metrics, client databases, everything I knew about how North Peak operated. Greg wanted me to hand over my knowledge like a gift, then walk away quietly. The smart move would have been to start looking for another job immediately, update my resume, make some calls, maybe even confront Greg directly, but something about the way he'd smiled when he said those words in Mandarin stopped me. The arrogance, the certainty that he held all the cards. I opened my email and responded to Greg's training request. Happy to help. Jacob, get up to speed. I'll make sure he learns everything. As I typed, I caught Greg watching me through his office window. He nodded approvingly and turned back to his computer. He had no idea that fluency worked both ways. While he thought Mandarin was his private language, it had become my window into his real intentions. That evening I stayed late. Not unusual for me, but instead of working on quality reports, I started reviewing access logs, system permissions, anything that might give me a clearer picture of what Greg had been doing while I'd been focused on my job. The building grew quiet around me. Security made their rounds, and I began to understand that Greg's plan to fire me was just the beginning of something much larger. I'd always been the reliable one at North Peak, at home, everywhere. When other quality engineers called in sick, I covered their shifts. When deadlines got tight, I worked weekends. When clients had complaints, Greg sent me to fix the relationships, because I could explain technical problems in plain English. My dad had been the same way at his plant in Vancouver before the Shanghai assignment. Loyal to a fault, he'd trained his replacement when his company restructured, thinking good work would be rewarded. Instead, they'd laid him off 6 months after his replacement was fully operational. I was 16 then. Watching him come home with that defeated look, promised myself I'd never let anyone use me like that. But here I was, following the same pattern. Greg had hired me fresh out of college. But then he'd seemed like a mentor, taught me the industry, introduced me to key suppliers, gave me progressively more responsibility. I'd respected his work ethic, his ability to navigate between the American side of the business and the Chinese ownership that had acquired North Peak. 2 years ago, the changes started. Greg began having more private conversations with Hengi during his quarterly visits, discussions in Mandarin that excluded the rest of the engineering team. I'd catch fragments here and there, usually about operational efficiency and cost reduction. Nothing alarming. Then Greg started questioning my project decisions, reviewing work he'd previously trusted me to handle independently. When I suggested a new vendor relationship that could save 15% on raw materials, he killed the proposal without explanation. When I identified a quality issue that could have prevented a major recall, he took credit for the catch during the next board call. The warning signs multiplied. Greg stopped including me in strategic planning sessions. He'd schedule important meetings when I was on the factory floor. He began assigning routine tasks to me while giving the complex problem-solving work to newer engineers with less experience. Most telling was how he'd started treating Jacob Torres even before Jacob officially started. I'd seen Greg walk Jacob through the facility during his interview, pointing out systems and processes with an enthusiasm he hadn't shown me in months. The way Greg spoke about Jacob's potential, his fresh perspective, his engineering degree from a top-tier program, I'd convinced myself it was normal. Growing pains, competition for resources, maybe even Greg trying to push me to perform better. But that conversation in Mandarin had crystallized everything. This wasn't about performance. It was about replacement. The smartest part of Greg's plan was the timing. Train Jacob thoroughly, ensure continuity, then eliminate my position. Clean, professional, no obvious wrongdoing. Just a business decision about redundancy and efficiency. What Greg didn't know was that my years in Shanghai had taught me more than language. They'd taught me how to read between the lines of what people weren't saying. The full weight of Greg's betrayal hit me Thursday morning when I overheard him on a call with human resources. He was discussing severance packages and exit procedures, not theoretical discussions about company policy, specific conversations about my termination. Kevin has been a solid contributor, but we need to optimize headcount, he said. Jacob brings fresh energy and costs significantly less. We can justify the transition as part of our efficiency initiative. I sat at my desk staring at my computer screen. 3 years of 60-hour weeks, 3 years of solving problems no one else wanted to tackle. 3 years of believing that hard work and competence mattered. All of it reduced to a line item in Greg's cost optimization spreadsheet. The anger came, first hot and immediate. I wanted to walk into his office and confront him, directly lay out everything I'd contributed, force him to acknowledge what he was throwing away, but the anger burned off quickly, replaced by something colder and more useful. Clarity. Began thinking like an auditor instead of an employee. Greg's behavior over the past 6 months suddenly made perfect sense when viewed through the lens of someone planning to eliminate a position. He'd been isolating me systematically, reducing my visibility, transferring my relationships and responsibilities to other people, building a case for my redundancy. But Greg had made one crucial error. He'd assumed I was just another engineering employee who'd accept whatever happened to me. He didn't know about my background, my language skills, my ability to understand conversations he thought were private. That afternoon, I started my real work, not the quality reports or process improvements that were officially my job. Began documenting everything I could access. About North Peak's financial operations. Payroll records, expense reports, vendor payments, anything that might reveal what Greg had been discussing so privately with Hengi. I worked, methodically copied files to secure drives, cross-reference transactions, built spreadsheets that tracked money flows over the past 2 years. What I found was more than suspicious. It was stemming. Greg had been skimming, systematically creating fake vendor invoices, approving his own expense reports for trips that never happened, billing personal purchases to company accounts. The amounts were carefully calculated to stay below audit thresholds, but over time they added up to serious money. More than that, I found evidence that Greg had been positioning himself for a promotion. Emails discussing his potential elevation to regional operations manager, a role that would give him oversight of 3 facilities instead of 1. More responsibility, more opportunities. My termination wasn't just about saving money on my salary. It was about Greg eliminating someone who might eventually notice his financial manipulations. Someone with enough system access and analytical skills to piece together what he'd been doing. I leaned back in my chair and looked through the glass partition toward Greg's office. He was on another call, probably with Hengi, speaking in what he assumed was his private language. But I understood every word, and now I had a plan. Monday morning arrived with Jacob Torres, 23 years old and eager to impress. Greg had assigned me a comprehensive training schedule, 3 weeks to transfer everything I knew about quality systems, vendor relationships, client protocols, and operational procedures. Kevin's our best quality engineer, Greg told Jacob during the introduction. He'll teach you everything you need to know. Smiled and shook Jacob's hand. The kid had no idea he was part of a larger scheme. Neither did most of my colleagues, who saw the training as normal onboarding, rather than a prelude to my elimination. For the first week, I followed Greg's training plan exactly, showed Jacob our testing protocols, introduced him to key suppliers, walked him through our quality management software. He was smart, asked good questions, and genuinely appreciated the knowledge transfer. But I also started testing Greg's defenses during a team meeting. On Wednesday, I raised concerns about some vendor payments I'd noticed while reviewing quarterly reports. Nothing dramatic, just professional due diligence about invoice discrepancies and approval procedures. Greg's reaction was immediate and telling. He dismissed my concerns as administrative errors, suggested I focus on current projects rather than historical financial reviews, made it clear that expense auditing wasn't part of my responsibilities. We have accounting and finance people for that kind of analysis. He said, let's stick to engineering. The message was clear. Stay in your lane. Don't ask questions about things that aren't your business. But his discomfort was obvious to anyone paying attention. The way he shifted in his chair, how quickly he changed the subject, the slight tremor in his voice when he said accounting handled those reviews. Thursday brought a more direct twist. I mentioned casually to Greg that Hengi's upcoming visit would be a good opportunity to discuss some efficiency improvements I'd been developing. Maybe present them during his facility tour. Greg's response was swift and definitive. Hengi's schedule is completely packed this visit. We won't have time for new presentations. Besides, he's focused on operational metrics, not theoretical improvements. But I'd already seen Greg's calendar. Hengi's visit included 2-hour block labeled simply as strategic review time that Greg intended to keep private, away from other engineers who might understand too much. By Friday, I'd confirmed what I suspected. Greg wasn't just planning to fire me. He was actively working to isolate me from anyone who might question my termination. When I suggested including Jacob in a client call, Greg insisted on handling it himself. When I offered to prepare monthly quality reports for Hengie's review, Greg said they'd already been completed. Everything was being filtered through Greg's control. He was creating a narrative where my departure would seem logical, even inevitable. The story would be simple. Kevin was a good engineer, but the company needed fresh talent and cost efficiency. Jacob represented the future. I represented past. The trap was elegant in its simplicity. Use my expertise to train my replacement, then eliminate me before I could cause any complications. Greg would get credit for smooth succession planning. Hengie would see improved cost metrics, and I'd be gone with a standard severance package and a professional recommendation. What Greg didn't anticipate was that his conversations with Hengie were providing me with valuable intelligence. Every private exchange in Mandarin revealed more about their strategy, their timeline, their expectations. By the end of Jacob's first week, I knew exactly when Greg planned to move. The following Friday, after Jacob completed his training but before he developed enough independence to question anything about my departure, Greg had calculated everything perfectly except for one variable. He'd never considered: my ability to understand conversations he thought were private, my access to financial systems he assumed I'd never scrutinize, and my growing determination to ensure that his plan would backfire in ways he couldn't imagine. That weekend I worked alone in the empty office building, not on training materials or quality reports. Was building a comprehensive audit of Greg's financial activities, documentation that would expose years of systematic theft and manipulation. Greg thought he was playing chess while I played checkers. He had no idea that I'd been watching his moves for months, learning his patterns and preparing for a game he didn't know had already begun. The second week of Jacob's training revealed the full scope of Greg's operation. As I walked Jacob through our vendor management system, I discovered payment records that didn't match any engineering projects I knew about, invoices from companies I'd never heard of, approved purchases for equipment that never appeared in our inventory. Greg had been running a sophisticated skimming operation for at least 2 years. Fake vendors with legitimate-looking business registrations, inflated invoices for real purchases with a difference redirected to accounts he controlled, expense reports for conferences and training that never happened, even payroll adjustments that gave him bonuses without board approval. The amounts were carefully calculated, never enough to trigger automatic audits, always below the thresholds that required additional authorization, but consistent enough to generate substantial income over time. Estimated Greg had stolen close to $300,000 since the Chinese acquisition. More disturbing was the timeline. Greg's theft had accelerated significantly after Hengie's first visit 18 months ago. Every quarterly review had been followed by increased financial manipulation, as if Greg was using his private conversations with the CEO to identify new opportunities for exploitation. Wednesday brought a revelation that changed everything. During a casual conversation, Jacob mentioned that Greg had specifically requested him during the hiring process, not through normal recruiting channels. Greg had identified Jacob at a university job fair and pursued him directly. He said, North Peak was looking for someone with my exact background. Jacob explained, fresh engineering degree, Mandarin language skills, willingness to start at entry level like he'd been searching for someone with those specific qualifications. Mandarin language skills. Greg hadn't mentioned that during Jacob's introduction. Why would a quality engineering position require Chinese language abilities unless Greg was planning something that involved direct communication with overseas leadership? That afternoon I accessed personnel files I'd never needed before. Jacob's resume confirmed what he told me. Fluent in Mandarin, study abroad, experience in Beijing, cultural familiarity with Chinese business practices, exactly the background someone would need to communicate effectively with Hangi and other Chinese executives. Greg wasn't just replacing me with someone cheaper. He was replacing me with someone who could serve as his intermediary with Chinese leadership, someone who could help him navigate the cultural and linguistic barriers that might limit his ability to manipulate the relationship. I began to understand Greg's longer-term strategy. With Jacob as his protege and translator, Greg could expand his influence within the Chinese ownership structure, position himself as the essential American bridge between two business cultures, leverage that position for promotion, increased authority, and more opportunities for financial manipulation. My termination was just the first step in a larger plan that would give Greg unprecedented access to company resources and decision-making processes. Jacob was unwittingly being recruited as an accomplice in a scheme that went far beyond simple embezzlement. Thursday's discovery confirmed my suspicions. Reviewing archived emails, I found correspondence between Greg and Hangi discussing regional expansion plans, multiple facilities, integrated operations, leadership opportunities for trusted managers who understood both American and Chinese business requirements. Greg was positioning himself to become Regional Operations Director, a role that would oversee several facilities and control millions of dollars in annual spending, with Jacob as his lieutenant and Chinese English translator. Greg would have the tools to scale his current theft into something much larger. The scope of Greg's ambition was breathtaking. He'd identified my linguistic abilities as a potential threat to his plans, recruited Jacob as the perfect combination of technical skills and cultural bridge, engineered my removal to eliminate the one person who might recognize the financial irregularities. But Greg had made one critical error. He'd assumed Jacob would be loyal, without question, that a new employee would accept whatever information and guidance he provided. Greg didn't consider that Jacob might be honest, observant, and increasingly uncomfortable with some of the things he was learning. By Thursday evening, I realized Jacob was starting to ask the same questions that had led me to Greg's financial manipulations. Friday of the second week, I made my decision. Instead of waiting for Greg to fire me, I would take control of the situation, but not through confrontation or accusations, through documentation and strategic timing. I spent the weekend creating a comprehensive evidence package, financial records showing the pattern of fake invoices and manipulated expenses, email correspondence that revealed Greg's conversations with vendors who didn't exist, payroll records demonstrating unauthorized bonuses and salary adjustments, bank account information linking Greg to the companies receiving fraudulent payments. More importantly, I documented Greg's systematic isolation of me from key operational decisions. The pattern of meetings I'd been excluded from, projects reassigned, without explanation responsibilities transferred to other engineers, evidence that my termination was planned well in advance and designed to eliminate oversight rather than improve efficiency. Monday began the final week of Jacob's training. Greg's behavior had shifted noticeably. He was more nervous, checking in frequently on our progress, asking detailed questions about what systems Jacob had accessed and what procedures he'd learned. Make sure Jacob understands our vendor approval process, Greg told me during a hallway conversation. He'll need to handle some of those relationships independently. Nodded and agreed, but I also made sure Jacob understood the proper approval procedures, the real ones, not the shortcuts Greg had been using to process fraudulent payments. Tuesday brought an unexpected complication. Hangi moved his quarterly visit up by a week. Instead of arriving the following Monday, he would be at North Peak Thursday and Friday. Greg's timeline was compressed. Whatever he'd planned for my termination would have to happen sooner. I watched Greg's increasing stress throughout Tuesday and Wednesday. More private phone calls, longer meetings behind closed doors, frequent conversations in Mandarin with someone I assumed was Hangi, finalizing details for the visit. Wednesday afternoon, Greg called me into his office. Kevin, I need to discuss some organizational changes with the Chinese ownership focusing on efficiency metrics. We're going to restructure the quality engineering team. Here it was, the conversation I'd been expecting. Instead of anger or surprise, I felt calm, almost relieved. Greg was finally showing his cards. Jacob's integration has gone better than expected, Greg continued. His fresh perspective and language skills make him valuable for our evolving relationship with Chinese leadership. We're going to transition him into a more independent role. Greg paused, waiting for my reaction. When I didn't respond immediately, he continued, your position will be eliminated as part of the restructuring, but we'll provide a generous severance package and strong recommendations. The transition will be effective Friday, after Hangi's visit concludes. He nodded thoughtfully. I appreciate the advanced notice. That gives me time to finish documenting everything for Jacob. Greg relaxed visibly. He'd expected resistance, arguments, maybe even that. My professional acceptance of his decision confirmed his belief that I was just another employee who'd accept whatever happened to him. I'm glad you understand, Greg said. This isn't personal, just business. Optimization. I stood to leave, then turned back. Greg, I do have one question. Hangi will be here. Would it be appropriate for me to brief him directly on some quality initiatives I've been developing? Might be good for him to hear about ongoing improvements before I transition out. Greg's answer was immediate and emphatic. That won't be necessary. Hangi's agenda is completely full. Besides, I'll be handling all communications with Chinese leadership. Perfect. Greg had just confirmed that he intended to control all information flow between American operations and Chinese ownership. Exactly what someone planning financial fraud would need to do. Thursday morning, Hangi arrived and I put my plan into motion. Thursday at 10 a.m., Hangi arrived for his quarterly review. Greg met him at the entrance, speaking in rapid Mandarin about operational improvements and cost efficiencies. They headed directly to the conference room for what Greg had scheduled as a private strategic session. I waited 30 minutes, then knocked on the conference room door. Greg opened it with obvious irritation. Kevin, we're in the middle of important discussions. What do you need? I held up a thick folder and responded, in perfect Mandarin. Mr. Huang, I have some financial irregularities I need to discuss with. They concern unauthorized vendor payments and expense manipulations over past 2 years. The silence in that room was deafening. Hangi's eyes widened with surprise. Greg's face went completely white. You speak Mandarin? Hangi asked, still in Chinese. Fluently, I replied, continuing in his language. I lived in Shanghai for 5 years as a teenager. Understood. Every private conversation you and Greg have had during your visits. Greg tried to recover. Kevin, this is completely inappropriate. Interrupting. Including the conversation last week where Greg told you about firing me after I finished training. Jacob, I continued in Mandarin. And the discussion 2 months ago where you both talked about expanding his authority to other facilities. Hangi turned to Greg with a look of growing confusion and anger. You said Kevin didn't speak Chinese. You said he wouldn't understand our strategic discussions. Opened the folder and handed Hangi a summary sheet. These documents show systematic financial fraud, fake vendor invoices totaling over $300,000, unauthorized bonuses, expense reports for conferences that never happened, all approved by Greg using authority he claimed you had given him. Greg made one last desperate attempt. This is ridiculous. Kevin is making wild accusations because he's being let go. He's trying to cause problems. Wangi cut him off. He'd been scanning the documents, his expression growing darker with each page. These vendor names, I recognize several of them. You told me they were critical suppliers for quality improvements. They don't exist, I said simply. Bank accounts trace back to Greg's personal finances. The next hour was devastating for Greg. Hangi called the corporate attorneys. I presented my complete evidence package, including recorded conversations, financial records, and documentation of Greg's systematic deception. Jacob was brought in to confirm that Greg had specifically recruited him for his Mandarin skills and willingness to work below market rate. Greg's denials became increasingly frantic as the evidence mounted. He accused me of fabricating documents, claimed the financial irregularities were accounting errors, insisted that everything he'd done was authorized by Chinese leadership. Hangi had brought his own financial auditor who confirmed what I'd discovered. The fake vendors, manipulated expenses, and unauthorized payments were undeniable. The pattern of theft was clear and sophisticated. By 2 p.m., Greg was escorted from the building by security. The company immediately froze his accounts and initiated criminal fraud charges. The regional promotion he'd been angling for became an arrest warrant. 3 months later, Greg pleaded guilty to embezzlement and fraud charges. He received 4 years in prison and full restitution requirements that would bankrupt him financially. His reputation in the industry was destroyed. The Chinese ownership company initiated lawsuits that would follow him for decades. Jacob kept his position, but under proper oversight and legitimate responsibilities. Hangi offered me Greg's management role along with a significant salary increase and oversight of the expanded quality program Greg had pretended to develop. Accepted the promotion but insisted on transparent financial controls and regular auditing procedures. No one person would have the kind of unsupervised authority that had enabled Greg's theft. 6 months after Greg's arrest, I stood in the same conference room where I'd exposed his fraud, looking through the glass partition at the manufacturing floor where dedicated employees built products they could be proud of. Work continued. Honest work, legitimate. Success built on competence and integrity rather than deception, and fluency I'd learned wasn't just about language. It was about understanding when to listen, when to speak, and when silence becomes complicity.